It was the definition of attack versus defence in the second half of City's draw against Arsenal at the Etihad. And I know what you're thinking, Nobbins, why is there a basketball image on my screen? What's going on here? Don't worry, there is a method to the madness. In this video, what we are going to be doing is exploring the 2-2 draw. We're going to be talking about the general concept of how to break down a low block, how City can do it, why City struggled for so long in that second half, what Arsenal did so brilliantly well in that second half, but the tiny little mistake that Arsenal made towards the end of the game, which ultimately allowed City to win the game, and the key influence of Jack Grealish in that goal as well. We will touch on the first half, though, very briefly, but as I say, I want to focus more so on the second half. So in the first half, this was both teams' general out of possession shapes. What I found interesting from an Arsenal perspective was Partey and Rice actually swap sides. Normally, it's Partey on the right of midfield and then Rice as that left central midfielder. Arteta, from kickoff, opted to swap those two round. Maybe they identified a particular strength on City's left side, a particular weakness on Arsenal's right. I would suggest that it didn't quite work out, because from that first goal, it's obviously fantastic work by Savio, who pulls in Calafiori and then spins him. But if you look back at that goal, Partey is taken out of position by Bernardo Silva, which allows all that space and that huge gap between Saliba and Gabriel to form for Savio and Haaland to take advantage of it. So fantastic work by Savio. Question marks about Partey's positioning, again, too easily dragged out of position as Brighton did to him a couple weeks ago. Arsenal scored a screamer in the first half. City didn't learn their lesson in terms of the second corner. The red card, half-time, 2-1. So what was the main storyline of that second half? This is where we come to the basketball still. Now, this chap is Ben Simmons. Now, notoriously, he was terrible at shooting a three-pointer, so when you shoot outside of this semicircle here. So as you can see, the players just do not care about him having the ball from distance, because they know that he's not going to be able to shoot well. If he does shoot, he's just going to give up possession to them. And this was a similar thing how Arsenal felt against lots of the City players in that second half. The key thrust of that second half was always going to be, can City score from outside the box? Just going back to the point of how to beat a low block, there are a number of ways you can do it, so we are just going to get rid of Trossard for a moment. So in terms of how Arsenal set up in that second half, Arteta wanted to play, we'll just pretend that Saka is Ben White there just for a second. What Arteta wanted to do was play a 5-4, essentially, like that. What was actually happening was, because of the positioning of Bernardo, it was actually more of a 6-3. So in terms of how to break a low block, generally, in terms of the specific tools that City have, there are a number of ways you can go about it. For this game, I think Pep thought that Arsenal were going to be relatively defensive throughout, regardless of whether they had 10 or 11 men on the pitch. So he started 2 1v1 wingers out wide in Savio and Doku. It's really important to have these sorts of players on the pitch, because if the opposition are compact vertically, and that's absolutely what Arsenal were, in fact, it was something more like this, wasn't it? Then ideally you need 1v1 players to take out the opposition fullback / wing backs to deal with that horizontal compactness. Another way you can go about it is by playing lots of pocket players, lots of small space players to deal with the vertical compactness. Because again, if you look at the spaces throughout that game between Arsenal's backline and their midfield 3/4 ahead of them, there was no space. Arsenal making sure to be really compact and as hard to play against as possible. The other solution, therefore, is to position players on the outside of the box, ideally long shot specialists. The idea being that the opposition's forced back, that will hopefully eventually create space for, as I say, these long shot specialists to then take advantage. I've been trying to figure out what was Pep's thought process in that second half, because as an outsider looking in, there were some really weird decisions going on there. As we can see here, for example, there is realistically no serious long shot specialist on the pitch. The closest I think you'd say is Guardiola, but look at Guardiola's positioning. He's stationed within the box. Now, he's not done that for a laugh. He's done that because Pep's obviously told him to go there. What actually happened throughout the majority of that second half, because there's no Foden on the pitch either way, it took him until the 70th minute for Foden to come on. Bernardo out on the right wing. Now, he does really good work here. He does drag over Martinelli across, and that does allow Kovacic some space. But this is the perfect position for someone who is left-footed and who is good at shooting outside the box. If Foden picks up the ball there's a serious threat. And maybe Rice, Partey rush out to close the space even faster if it is Foden compared to Kovacic. As it was, Arsenal weren't really overly concerned. Foden came on around the 70th minute, so it's like, okay, we've got two players who are now good at shooting from distance in Foden and Guardiola. Again, question marks on why Pep positioned them in the box rather than outside it. Theory, Guardiola and Foden, we want them outside of the box, right? So if we just swapped out, Diaz and Akanji and popped them in the box, why didn't Pep do that, or why didn't he do it sooner? Theory, maybe because if Arsenal's block pushes out to engage with, a Foden or Guardiola, that obviously leaves a lot of space between Arsenal's backline and Arsenal's midfield. In which case, if the shot opportunity isn't on, then you want to be able to exploit that space. So you'd imagine a ball in from, let's say, Foden or Guardiola into the feet of these players. But the issue now is that the players receiving the ball are Diaz, Akanji. They aren't small space operators like, a Foden, a Bob, a Gundogan, a Rico Lewis. So maybe Pep's thinking was, I actually want my more dangerous shooters inside the box because of that issue if you have them outside the box. Now, I personally think that's an overly negative way to look at the second half. It was always going to be 100% Arsenal defending. What I would have liked to see City do is maybe do something as extreme as take off Diaz for Foden. Something like that. Arsenal were never going to trouble City going forwards because they didn't want to, and nor did they have to. So I think a braver approach would have been more appropriate. And then you've got the benefits of the small space players in the box, but you also have long shot specialists outside. So maybe the thinking was, it doesn't matter that Kovacic, Diaz, Akanji, Walker, whoever, are taking these poor quality shots, because Arsenal are camped so deep and so close to their own goal that maybe a fortunate deflection will happen at some point, in which case Pep's thinking maybe is, well, I want it to fall to someone who I know is going to be able to take a shot and take it well, whereas if it falls to, Diaz, Akanji, maybe it's not that way of thinking. And that did happen, in fairness, with Guardiola a couple of times. This is another way to try to get around a low block, is to just fizz in the ball really quickly and low and hard to force the issue and maybe cause an error and cause confusion, maybe win a second ball. That's actually what happens here. And it fell to Guardiola on both occasions where this happened. So if Guardiola scored one of these, maybe you would have said Pep's thinking was actually correct, in fairness. So Gundogan pops it in there. Guardiola now challenges it. There's a second ball opportunity here. This is now a situation that Arsenal aren't really prepared for, because a second ball can go anywhere. A deflection can go anywhere. Guardiola contests it with Partey and eventually falls to Guardiola. Now, all of a sudden, out of nothing, just a nothing cross, which happens to take a fortunate deflection. Second ball, now Guardiola actually has a decent sight at goal. Raya with a save you expect him to make, but it's still a good save. And it happened later on as well. This time, Diaz with an actual good cross. Foden wins the aerial duel. Once again, Partey, second ball, not able to deal with it properly, falls to Guardiola. As before, it's the second ball situation. This time, it's an even better save. So maybe that was the thinking there. I still don't personally agree with that, if that was the way to go about it. But what I would say is that it is a point of compounding probability. It's all well and good saying, well, City, took shots where it was only 0.03 XG. But they took about 30 shots in that second half. The chances are at least one of those is going to fall fortuitously for a City player. Let's now address how City ultimately were able to break through that low block in the second half, specifically the introduction of Jack Grealish. Now, Jack Grealish has something called gravity. Lots of players at City have this, for example, Erling Haaland, where essentially the idea is that when he's on the ball, or in fact when he is off it, players are attracted to him. They are sucked in by him because they know that they can't just leave him isolated and alone. So, for example, in most games, you'll notice that Haaland is picking up one, maybe even two defenders at a time because they are so concerned about him. And it often pushes the opposition backline as well. Grealish, similar thing. Players are attracted to him. Later on in the game, 2 players are attracted to him. Now look at the space for all of these players, because again, Arsenal are concerned with Jack Grealish being in the box. That is the gravity, that is the effect of Grealish being on the pitch. And Arsenal were superb defensively in the second half, helped by City's approach, but nevertheless, they were superb. But this is maybe the first sign of maybe 1 or 2 Arsenal players switching off, and that is ultimately what would cost them in terms of the goal as well, because look at Havertz, hands on his head. He's not expecting that ball to fall anywhere near him, and why would you? But this is what we were talking about earlier, that compounding probability of if you take enough shots, one of them will eventually fall in your favour. I think it's Ruben Diaz taking that shot, takes the deflection. There's no way you would ever predict this ball to fall to Phil Foden. And why would you? That's why Havertz got his hands on his head. He's not really concentrating at that moment. But it does. Havertz now realises his mistake. He switches on. Foden, I think, should probably do better with the pass. Haaland makes it work. I actually think Haaland should do better with the shot. But that was all crafted due to Grealish's gravity. This conversation happened in the 90th minute. Personally, I think that should happen at the start of the second half, but it is what it is. Guardiola now telling Foden and Kovacic to swap places. So Kovacic, you go in the box. Foden, you go outside of it. To me, that makes much more sense, but now maybe Guardiola's decided, I can't really be relying on this deflection ball game because it's not working. Maybe we do need to just score from outside the box. Again, that's just a theory of mine. I don't know whether that's actually the case. And this is that change in action. It works almost immediately. Grealish on the ball here. He drags 2 Arsenal players over to him. And once again, Foden literally hands in the air going, please, pass to me. That is in the perfect position for someone like Foden based on his goal scoring from last season. There's no Arsenal players really near him. Sadly, in this instance, from a City perspective, Guardiola is not quick enough in the action. He needs to ideally first time play it into Foden or realise that that is the play. As it was, he dillies, he dallies, he's closed down, and also Rice realises the threat of Foden. Now that pass is totally off. But once again, despite that Guardiola error, in my opinion, it all came about due to Grealish. This is the goal. Beats Ben White. Low ball in, you never know what's going to happen, deflection maybe. And this is the tiny little mistake, the details. Having to play like this for over 50 minutes is emotionally, physically, mentally draining for teams to do this, no matter how elite you are. It's really easy to switch off, and that's absolutely what you must not do. But in this instance, Grealish's short corner, Arsenal had switched off. They weren't quite ready for it. It came back immediately to Grealish from Gundogan. Arsenal aren't quite set defensively. They're a little bit panicked here, so much so that Grealish is able to attract 3 Arsenal players. 1, 2, 3. Havertz, White and Partey, I believe that is. What does that mean? If Grealish is doing his job and attracting other players, that means there must be space for someone else. Space, space, space. And this is how the goal is scored. Because at no point in the game, throughout the entirety of that second half, were Arsenal in a situation where they were this deep, where it's basically a line of 9, essentially. There is no defence separating the midfield. It's just one long line, basically. And again, that's, I think, come from the fact that they weren't quite able to get themselves set up because they were caught unaware by Grealish's short corner. Grealish makes the correct decision. He plays in Kovacic. If Kovacic doesn't hit it, Foden's there as well. And this goes beyond the idea of it being a purely lucky goal, partly because of what we discussed before, where if you take enough shots, surely at least one of them will go in, or one of them will result in a lucky deflection. But also, look at the space. Never in that second half does City have that much space, that close to Arsenal's box. And once again, it's all thanks to Jack Grealish's gravity. Kovacic's shot. The deflection, finally, from a City perspective, falls to a City player. All Stones has to do is pop it in the back of the net. And that ultimately is how Grealish, through his gravity, was able to finally break through Arsenal's block. Was it good enough as a City performance? No, not in my opinion. Whatever the reasoning, rationale was from a Guardiola perspective, I personally disagree with it. I've tried to provide an explanation as to why he may have done that because I still can't quite figure out what it was, but it seems to me that he was maybe relying on the idea of that compounding probability and the idea of surely one of these shots will result in a fortunate deflection for us if we take enough of them. In fairness, that's obviously how the goal was scored, but it would have been impossible but for Jack Grealish, who, by the way, is having a wonderful season. Thank you guys so much for watching. Really hope you enjoyed it. I will maybe be doing a future video on the Rodri situation. How can City survive without him? Can City survive without him? So do make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on that video and any other future analysis videos.